Chris here with the Crabapple Cottage. Today I'm outside in my beautiful garden. I'm sitting next to my elderberry bush just to have a nice background, and I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about my gardening philosophy, why I plant what I plant, my long-term goals with my garden, and that sort of thing. I realized when I posted a video a few days ago doing a June garden tour that I show you guys everything in my garden, but I don't really talk about why I plant what I plant and what I'm intending to do with the garden. So that's what this video is. It's not a tour, it's just a discussion about what I'm doing in my garden. As I think most of you know, not only am I a gardener, but I'm a prepper. And so my garden is really geared towards long-term food self-sufficiency and survival, as well as just like general homesteading principles. I live on a 1/4 acre in a small town in rural west central Ohio, and my goal is to really fill my 1/4 acre completely with food and medicine producing plants, preferably perennials. I like the idea of planting something once and getting a harvest from it for years. So for example, I started with your basics, strawberries and asparagus. Those are the two first perennial food plants that I put in my garden. And obviously from there I've greatly expanded. I have like a couple dozen fruit trees and probably, I don't know, several dozen fruit producing berry bushes and canes, and another few dozen perennial herbs. So all told, I probably have well over 100 different varieties of useful plants, perennial plants in my garden. I always intended to put in perennial food sources so that if there was a worst case scenario, either food supply disruption, inability to get certain types of items, heaven forbid something much more serious occur where you're relying on what you can grow and harvest and forage, plus what you have in your stores. So that was sort of the motivating factor behind my garden. I obviously store long-term food storage as well as short-term. I have a rotating pantry, which I show in very great detail in one of my earlier videos. And I also have long-term food storage. So that includes things like rice, beans and lentils, sugar, salt, wheat berries, things like that. So that's kind of where I started in my prepping journey, but I also knew that I wanted to be able to provide a lot of my own fresh food from my garden. Let's take a survival situation. Maybe there's an EMP, there's some sort of a natural disaster, there's a food supply chain disruption, and you have to live off what you have in your stores. Well, your short-term rotating food pantry is going to feed you hopefully for a few months. Those are your canned goods, your box meals, things like that. Things that you kind of normally eat on a regular basis. Once that runs out, then you're going to move into your long-term food storage. So that's your rice, your beans, your wheat berries, that sort of thing. But once you get to those long-term food storage options, your flavor and nutritional profile is going to be drastically reduced. So you can live off of rice and beans, yes, but you're going to be missing a lot of key nutrients, vitamin C, vitamin A, stuff like that. I'm not a nutritionist, so don't take my word for it. But so the thought was that my garden should do several things. It should produce food that provides a lot of calories and bulk. So that's going to be things like carbohydrates in various forms. It should produce foods that will give me vitamins and minerals that may be missing from my long-term food storage. So that's going to be things like leafy greens and fruits and things like that that are going to provide nutritional density, not density, nutritional quality. And then the third thing is foods that provide flavor, because eating rice and beans every day for an indefinite period of time obviously is going to get very boring very fast, and having flavor profiles that you can add to that is going to greatly enhance your long-term food storage. So that was kind of my motivating idea. So let's talk about those three categories and what I'm planting in my garden for those. So the first one is calories and bulk. So obviously, to survive long term, you need calories, just basic calories. We tend to get those things from mostly grains in our culture, corn, wheat, that sort of thing. Obviously, we eat a lot of wheat in American culture, as well as a lot of corn. So the thought was that I should be producing those types of foods in my garden to help supplement the rice that I have stored. So obviously you can plant corn. Sweet corn is going to give you some calories, but really it's that field corn or dent corn or seed corn, whatever you want to call it, that is going to be have long-term storage ability. And also you can use it in a variety of ways. You can grind it up to make like a Johnny cake or a cornbread. You can make a hominy or a porridge or a mush. You can add it as a bulk to various ingredients. So that was the idea behind corn. Now, corn is not a perennial, obviously, it's an annual, but you can seed save corn. So for example, last year I grew 3 different types of corn, and I saved seed from 2 of those types. I'll just say this real quick. I know you're not supposed to grow multiple types of corn in a small garden at one time. I didn't know that last year. I hope my seed is true. It appears to be true. I grew a blue popcorn, and then I grew a very tall white dent corn. So they seem to be fine. But anyways, the idea is that you can grow that, and then you can provide calories and density to your diet. In addition to corn, another annual plant that provides calorie density and bulk to your diet so that you don't feel hungry is potatoes. Actually, let's divide this into 2, potatoes and sweet potatoes. Now, sweet potatoes are a perennial in warmer climates. Here in zone 6A, they are not perennial. This is my first year growing sweet potatoes. I grew them from a store-bought sweet potato that I bought, and then I sprouted to get the slips, put the slips in pots. It seems to be doing very well. I obviously haven't harvested yet, but that is a renewable source of calories, because you know, once you harvest your sweet potatoes, you can then store those in a root cellar or something like that, and then the following spring you can use a sweet potato to produce more slips, which you then plant in your garden and continue that cycle. So I'm excited to add sweet potatoes to my garden repertoire. Now, potatoes, I've been doing potatoes for, I think this is my third or fourth year with potatoes. Again, pretty self-replicating, because you store your potatoes. By the end of the winter, they're getting kind of shriveled and gross. They're probably sprouting, but that's great for seed potatoes. You cut those up, put those in your pots or your garden, and you've got another food source that can just replicate itself. So while potatoes and sweet potatoes are annuals, they have a continuous food production ability. Another type of annual plant that is very calorically dense that I've added to my garden, that is beans. Specifically shell beans that you shell out of the pod and then you store them dry. You can do things like make chili with them, add them to bean soup, that sort of thing. I tend to grow scarlet runner beans. They're not as prolific as other varieties, but they have a really beautiful red flower. They vine up my trellises. They're really pretty. I do use those beans in my chili. I usually get enough for like 1 big pot of chili every year. I actually probably should really like double or triple the amount of scarlet runner beans that I plant, but those are also shelf stable, so you can save those beans and plant them again the next year. So that is another source of caloric dense shelf stable annuals that I plant in my garden. Other annual veggies that produce a lot of calories and that are really good on the shelf or store for long periods of time are things like your squashes. Those have a fair amount of calories. They have a lot of vitamins in it too, but you could probably put those in sort of the like calorically dense category. So your pumpkins, your winter squashes, butternut squash, things like that, as well as some of your root veggies like parsnips, carrots, rutabaga, beets, those sorts of things. A lot of those provide a lot of nutrients as well, a lot of vitamins, but they also are pretty shelf stable and provide a lot of calories. Looking beyond annuals, let's talk a little bit about perennial food sources that will provide the same caloric value. Another bulk food that I'm recently trying this year actually, is Jerusalem artichoke. I ate Jerusalem artichoke. It was a cream of Jerusalem artichoke soup, kind of like a baked potato soup that I had here in a local restaurant. It was a complete accident. I just happened to walk in and their soup of the day was this Jerusalem artichoke soup, which was pretty exciting for me because even though I had purchased the roots to plant this year, I had never actually tasted them. So that was kind of exciting and it was delicious. I will specify that I did have a little bit of gastric distress with the Jerusalem artichoke soup. You've probably heard that they've also been called called artichokes because they do produce gas. It's not like a loose stool situation. I know this is TMI, but just to be upfront, it's not like a loose stools or stomach ache sort of situation. It's just kind of a gassy situation. Like if you eat beans and maybe if you don't digest beans very well, it's a very similar sort of situation. So it was kind of like uncomfortable and awkward, but it wasn't painful, and it tasted really good. So obviously Jerusalem artichokes wouldn't be my preference for calories and density, but by growing them in my garden, I have that option. They are perennial. They produce a pretty tall plant with a sunflower-like or daisy-like yellow flower on them, and I've heard they spread prolifically. So I can't remember. I have a video about it. I think I purchased like 10 little root pieces and I planted them in a flower box up on my porch. Eventually, I will be moving those into my garden, into a corner where it's okay if they spread. In fact, I want them to spread. I want them to take over that portion of the garden because I want A, an endless supply of food, B, I want to choke out weeds like thistles that may encroach upon that space. So they serve a double function. Plus, they're beautiful. So those will be going into the back corner of the garden later today, or not today, later this year. But that's another food source that provides a lot of calories, a lot of bulk, used very much like a potato. Another food source that is perennial that can serve a similar function is the daylily. So you can actually eat the daylily tubers. They're not very large, but you can eat them. You can eat them much like potatoes. I tend to sort of slice them up and kind of like pan fry them. I tried mashing them and they're a little too fibrous to get a good fluffy mash, but you can eat them by slicing them into a potato or something like that. You can probably do a soup from them too, honestly. I only have a couple of daylily plants in my garden, so something that I want to do is add a lot more daylily plants. If you're familiar with eating daylilies, you can also eat the young shoots in the spring, and you can also eat the flower buds. You can kind of like batter them and fry them up like a fritter. You can actually do that with elderberry flowers too. They do provide calories, dense calories, and kind of filling, even though they're pretty small. So my perennial dense calories sources will be Jerusalem artichokes and daylily tubers. I also have air potatoes, little bulbs from air potatoes that I received that I haven't planted yet. I need to plant those in a pot because apparently those can get kind of invasive as well. Although now that I think about it, maybe I want invasive. They produce a large tuber or rhizome that you can eat, but once you harvest that, you kill the plant. But they also produce these little potato-like bulbs on the plant, on the leaves and stems of the plant that you prepare much like a potato. And they call them yam berries sometimes because they're just like picking little yams or potatoes off the plant. So I do have those to plant as well. So those are some additional carbohydrate dense, calorie dense foods that I'm growing in my food forest. Okay, so let's talk about the next category of food that I'm growing in my survival / prepper food forest garden. That is things that have high nutritional content. So not necessarily a lot of calories, but they provide a lot of things like vitamin C, vitamin A, all those other vitamins that you really need to stay healthy. So your caloric dense foods are going to fill you up and provide calories. These other foods are going to give you vitamins that you may be missing that might give you things like scurvy. So obviously that's going to include most of my fruits and vegetables, both the annuals that I grow in my bed, as well as the berry bushes and the fruit trees that I have. So some of the vegetables that I grow in my annual beds are your typical things like kale, collards, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, spinach, some green beans, peas, although those are kind of caloric dense carbohydrates as well, tomatoes, green peppers, those types of things. So those are some of the annual veggies that I grow, and some of them you can seed save. Some are obviously easier to seed save than others. I mostly do like peas and beans. I seed save those. Tomatoes, I don't save the seeds from every year, but they self-seed themselves. I find them not just in the bed where I grew tomatoes, I find them all over the garden. They just, I don't know, birds carry them there or what, but I find them everywhere. So those are some of the annuals, and like I said, one of the things I really want to do more of is seed saving. I'm experimenting with that, so we'll keep developing that skill. I should mention that gardening is a learning process. I've been gardening, well, I used to garden a lot when I was younger. I actually worked at a couple different garden centers, but I haven't gardened intensely since, well, really since 2020, 2021 is when I started, for obvious reasons. And so part of that is the learning process. So learning how to seed save. I have a book on seed saving, so while I don't do a ton of seed saving right now, it's a skill that I'm A, trying to learn, and B, something that I have a written resource that I can access if I need to. Some other annual veggies that provide nutrients are things like onions, although I would put onions probably more in the category of flavor. So those are some of the annual veggies that I plant that have a lot of, that don't really fill you up. Spinach doesn't fill you up. You can eat a lot of spinach and you will not be full, but it is so nutrient dense. So it is something that I grow in my garden. Unfortunately, it's not something that's super easy to preserve. I do dehydrate and powder some of my annual veggies, a lot of my greens. I will do that, and then I will sprinkle the green powder in things like scrambled eggs or soups or casseroles. So that is a way to kind of preserve it. But again, green powder is not going to fill you up. That's why it's so important to have the calorically dense foods in your preps. So some of the perennial veggies that I grow, or that I've begun to grow, that will provide nutrients but maybe not necessarily be super filling, are things like hostas. You can actually eat the young shoots of hostas in the spring, just like you would eat like asparagus. In fact, in parts of Asia, I believe that hosta shoots are very, very commonly eaten. I haven't eaten hostas myself. I've only got a couple of plants, but that's one of the things that I want to add more of to my garden. Things that are along the same lines: Solomon seal, that produces an edible shoot in the spring as well, that's prepared very much the same way. I just planted some Solomon seal for the first time in my garden this year, as well as ostrich ferns, which are also known as fiddlehead ferns. Again, you can eat the small fronds, the small little fiddlehead fronds, early in the springtime. I've also recently planted Good King Henry and garden sorrel. I also have red vein sorrel in my garden that I've had for a couple of years. The red vein sorrel isn't super yummy. The leaves are a little more astringent and sour, and a little tougher than I think than regular garden sorrel is, but I do have it. You could cook it up as a pot herb in a pot with like meat or bacon or onions or something like that. So I do have that as well. And then of course, asparagus is probably the most well-known perennial veggie that you eat in the early spring. So I have quite a few types of veggies, perennial veggies, that you eat in early spring. And I'm going to continue to expand that as I become aware of other varieties as well. As far as perennial fruits, obviously the sky is the limit with that. I grow dozens of different types of perennial fruits in my garden. Most of them haven't started producing yet because they're only 2, maybe 3 years old. But as far as fruit trees, I have apple, pear, peach, nectarine, plum, plumcot, cherry, a couple different types of cherry. Those are the major, like, common fruit trees that I have, and of each variety I have at least 2 different varieties of each type of tree. Some I have 3 because a lot of times they need cross-pollination. I also have some less common fruit trees or large shrubs, elderberry being one. Elderberry is really important because not only are the berries edible, you can make them into like a jam or like a wine or a syrup, but it's also very medicinal. It's really good for colds and that sort of thing, which you probably are aware of. But some of the other more unusual berries, bushes and such that I have serviceberry. I have my Nanking bush cherries that I grow in the front. They're called a cherry because they look like a little cherry, but I think they're more closely related to plums, if I'm not correct. Let's see, what else do I have as far as fruits? American native plum, Japanese persimmon, American persimmon, Georgia red mayhaw. Trying to think what else. I think that's the bulk of the like large bush or small tree fruits that I have. I will note that I try to trim all of my fruit trees, all of my standard fruit trees down to a very small size. It's a method known as grow a little fruit tree. So if that's something you're interested in, Google grow a little fruit tree. I do have a video where I prune some of my fruit trees to keep them small, and so far they've stayed pretty small. The idea is that you should be able to just reach up and harvest your fruit. You shouldn't have to use a ladder. So I do try to keep those pretty small. And you can do that with any size of tree, as far as like you can buy a standard peach tree and you can prune it to keep it small. So that's the method that I'm using. It helps you get more variety into a small area and makes it easier to harvest, obviously. Other fruits that I have, which I show in my garden tours, I have a wide variety of berry canes. I have both yellow and red raspberries. I have blackberries, loganberries, marionberries, black raspberries, and boysenberries. Those are all berry canes that I grow in my garden. And then some of the bushes that I have include things like goji berry, hardy fig, josta berry, 4 different types of currants. I have the black, red, white, and pink. Let's see here. I have mulberry, dwarf mulberry. I have a variety of berry producing or fruit producing vines. So I have hardy kiwi, and I have 6 different varieties of grapes currently growing in my garden as well. I have some other ones that I'm wanting to plant, and maybe I'll do a video on that. I also plant, I forgot to mention, I also have pawpaw trees, although I keep trying to plant them and they keep dying, so that's still a work in progress. I've also ordered and tried planting autumn olive, honeyberry, that's another bush that I have growing in my garden, blueberry, Rosa rugosa, which has edible rose hips. Too many to list, really. I can't even think of all the different types of fruit-producing trees and shrubs that I have in my garden. I also have a lot of fruit-producing ground covers. Obviously, strawberries are the best known, but I have things like bearberry. I have a very low creeping raspberry, 2 different kinds actually of low creeping raspberries. I have an Arctic raspberry and a carpet raspberry. I also have aronia berry, a low creeping aronia berry version. Cranberry is another ground cover, and I have cranberries growing in my garden as well. So there's just so many different types of fruits that people don't even think about. Another type of food producing plant that I have in my garden that is kind of similar to fruits is nuts. Currently I just have 2 different types of nuts growing in my garden. I have hazelnuts and I have an almond tree. A note about nut trees. Nut trees tend to take up a lot of space, and I only have a 1/4 acre. The hazelnuts are the smallest nut tree really that you can plant in my zone 6A. So I have 2 of those. You do need 2 varieties, I think, to get nuts. I have the almond tree, which is kind of in the corner of my garden, so a lot of the growth will be kind of like over the alleyway. And then the other nut tree that I'm going to be planting is hickory nuts. I'm going to be planting the hickory nut in the front along the parking strip, because then it will take up, you know, a nut tree. Like I said, it has the trunk, but then so much of the space is the shade that it creates and the canopy. And so being out in the parking strip, it's going to overhang the street, overhang the sidewalk, and it's going to make the best use of the space that I have. So that's going to be going out there as well. I'll probably get those next year. And other ones that I can't think of off the top of my head, you can check out my tour video where I mention some of them. If that's something you're interested in, I can produce a complete list of all the edible food producing plants that I have in my garden, if that's something people are interested in. Sometimes it's helpful to see those lists because you can be like, oh, I never thought of that. I want to add that to my garden. So I can do that. If you're interested in that, just leave me a comment down below and I'll do that. Yeah, so those are some of the fruit producing bushes and trees and stuff that I have in my garden. And obviously you can get full on some of those fruits, like eating apples will fill you, apples and pears, and even things like peaches and plums. If you eat enough of them, those will fill you up, not for a long period of time, but they will fill you up. But what they do is provide a lot of nutrients that you need, vitamin C especially, and then also flavor, you know, adding, say, dried fruit to your oatmeal, which maybe you're storing in your long-term food preps, is going to extend the life of your preps and also give you a lot more flavor, so it's not quite as tedious to consume. Okay, so then let's talk about the third category, which is flavor. So some of the plants that I'm growing in my garden for flavor include my Egyptian walking onions. Obviously, those are a perennial onion. You can eat both the green scapes from them as well as the onion bulbs. They're not as big as regular bulbs. I also have things like garlic chives and chives in my garden. I'm going to be planting ramps or wild leeks in my garden as well this year. I have those, the seeds for those, so I'm going to plant those. I'm trying to think what else. Okay, then the usual. I have oregano, thyme, various types of thyme, mint, and oregano. I've got well, I don't think pennyroyal is edible. I've got, basically, if there's a perennial herb that you can cook with, I'm growing it. Lovage, that has a celery flavor that you can add to soups and stuffings and stuff like that. So I'm growing all those herbs. If there's a perennial herb out there that tastes good, fennel, I'm growing it in my garden. Okay, so in addition to those three categories that I talked about, which is calorically dense, nutritionally dense, and flavor, the other thing I'm growing a lot of in my garden is medicinal plants, or plants that may have an additional use. Primarily medicinal, but I do have a few plants that have other uses. For example, I'm planting soapwort seeds, which produce a lather that you can actually use in place of soap. And I'm also planting, or I have in my pots, I have some bayberry plants, which they produce a wax on the berries that you can actually boil the berries, and the wax floats to the top, and you can make candles out of it. A lot of the culinary herbs that I mentioned, mint, for example, chamomile, are edible, but also have a medicinal value. But obviously, mint, chamomile, those are a couple of them. Things like calendula, echinacea, St. John's wort. I can't even think of them off the top of my head. I don't know all the medicinal plants, and I don't even know the uses of all the medicinal plants that I have in my garden. But what I do have is resources. So I have this book, which I think it's backwards for you guys. It's The Lost Book of Herbal Remedies by Nicole Appalachian. I use this, and it's really great. So what I basically did is I went through the book, and I identified all the herbs that she has in here. And if they were perennial, I bought either seeds or plants, and I'm trying to grow those in my garden. For example, New Jersey tea plant. I just happened to pull up that one. New Jersey tea. I have a plant of that I'm going to be planting in my garden this year. Let's see, what else has she got in here? Partridge berry. I did grow some I have some partridge berry plants that I'm going to be putting in my garden. Solomon seal obviously has other uses. In addition to being edible, Solomon seal has some medicinal use. Let's see what else here. Don't have that. St. John's wort skullcap. That's something that I've planted in my garden this year that has medicinal use. So most of my herbs that you see in the garden, if you don't recognize them for their culinary uses, they're probably there because they're medicinal. And even though, like I said, I don't have it memorized what they're used for, I have books, and this isn't my only book. I actually have probably 5 or 6 different books that talk about herbal remedies. And if I don't have it in the book, then I have printed something offline. So that is the other thing that I have in my garden that is sort of prep or survival related. The idea is that if we had a situation where we can no longer get our pharmaceuticals or over-the-counters, that I would be able to, at least to some extent, provide first aid and medicine for my family. For example, I suffer with some depression and mental illness, so I decided to plant St. John's wort. That's just an example of one I can think of off the top of my head. You may want to focus specifically on ailments that your family deals with, like if they deal with heart issues or high blood pressure or whatever. You may want to see what plants are out there that have been proven to help with that and grow those specifically in your garden. Even if you're not using them on a regular basis right now, obviously, ideally, I would be using those herbs on a daily basis. I'm not at that place yet, but it doesn't mean that I can't plant them in my garden and have them in case of an emergency. So that is the other thing that I have in my garden. So there we go. There's a quick look at some of the different plants that I've planted in my garden, why I've planted them, and kind of the way that I use my garden as a third level of food prep and survival prep. You know, with your prepping, your food prep, you basically have your daily or fresh foods that you keep in your refrigerator, maybe on your cabinet. You have your rotating pantry, things that you use up within a few months, maybe a year or two. Your long-term food storage, things that are last, 20 to 30 years. And then the garden provides for me a fourth layer of food security and medicine that I can rely on in case of food insecurities. So there we go, guys. There's a look at my garden, look at why I'm planting what I'm planting. Again, if you have interest in growing your own prepper survival garden on a small space like I am, like I'm on a 1/4 acre, then leave me a comment below and I can provide some additional resources. I can provide you a link to a map of my garden that shows where I'm planting things and why I'm planting there. I can provide a list of the different plants that I have in my garden, plants that I still want in my garden. For example, there's quite a few different types of fruits and stuff that I still want to acquire. I want to acquire gummy berry. There's a whole bunch of other fruit trees that I want to plant in the front. Quince is one of them that I have never really tasted before. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and I'll talk to you later.